Hello and welcome back to the Witch Source. And this is Whitney, and I have Adam here with me. I guess I should say also known as Raven now. I always forget that.
Yeah.
And we are covering the part 2 of the Magic Circle because, yeah, there was a lot still to cover.
Yes, so much.
So we talked about why the Magic Circle is important and why you need it and what its basic energetic function is. I feel like we covered some of that before.
hmm
And a lot of that was just our experiences, what we've learned, what we know. So expanding into part 2 of the circle, we want to talk about and give people information as far as more of how they can create or use a magic circle themselves. So I went a little bit more studious with this, going old school. So I went to the books, like I like to do. So I will be sharing the author and the book that I got the information out of, so you guys know who said what and their opinions on the Magic Circle and their points that they feel like were important to share before we get into the basic structure and what's needed. So giving you guys a go ahead of what we're going to talk about. So I started with one of my favorite authors, who is Raven Grimassi. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. I cried when I found out he passed. Literally cried. He was one of my favorites. And I pulled from his book, Witchcraft, A Mystery Tradition. And he explains that the circle, I'm going to paraphrase because I don't want to actually read you quote for quote. But essentially he says that the magic circle exists in the state between worlds, which is something that we talked about. But once you create that magical circle, it's basically hanging in a non-physical realm. And you're actually a circle within a circle at this point. And that the outer edge of this circle that you're creating, which is the visible or invisible if you're not using an actual physical barrier, which we'll get into, that is where in this sphere that goes above and below, that physical circle is really just the marking point of where this circle is touching the physical earth. And that's why you work inside of it. And it's funny because he talks about that some people, when they're looking at the actual sphere, people are like, okay, well, you can't stand too close to the edge because your head will be outside of this sphere. But in actuality, you're in a circle within a circle. So the it's not so structured like a ball that your head's going to be lopped off if you're standing too close to the edge. So apparently that's something that was important for people to understand because he did comment on that. So there's really, you have the sphere that you're in, but then there's a wider sphere that is actually the container. You want to stay inside the circle that you created, but you have space to move and work. And you also want to allow yourself that space to move and work when you're creating and casting that circle. So I thought that was interesting, that he felt it was necessary to
Yeah.
do.
One of the things that I'm thinking of is like, as you were describing it, is like a bubble.
Yeah.
And, bubbles, they move, they have their own kind of general structure, but maintain a general shape.
Right.
And so it's basically like being in your magical bubble.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
there's a little bit of playroom there, but of course, if you breach certain points, then bubble
Right.
gone.
Right. Exactly. If you go outside of that perimeter, then you have a problem. but you do have room to move within that perimeter that you set without worrying about, the curvature of your body like cutting through. So he also says that the cardinal points, which we talked about at the north, south, east, and west, are elemental gateways or portals. And I don't know that we talked too much about that
So we
before.
didn't. We did not really touch on the cardinal points,
Okay.
and the elements. We just kind of briefly mentioned it, I believe, and just moved on.
Okay. So yeah, he explains that the point in which the cardinal points, of course, align with the elements. And depending on what tradition you're looking at, they can be a little bit different. But typically, you've got your earth in the north, your air in the east, your fire in the south, and your water in the west.
Mhm.
That seems to be pretty commonplace. Now, one of the books that we'll get into it, but he mentioned in his tradition, which he feels like is much more traditional and not tied to any particular tradition or Wiccan tradition. He actually looks at the land which is around him to decide his elements, which I thought was an interesting way to do it. So the example that he gave was when he is doing his circle outside, he uses air from the north because he says that's where the strongest winds come in, where he's located. He does fire in the east because that's where the sun rises. He does earth in the south because south of him is a huge, beautiful wooded area. And then water is still in the west, but it's because the largest body of water closest to him is to the west. So if you want to take a more personalized approach to your craft and be very much rooted within where you're at within nature and the land around you, that could be an option.
I think that's actually a great idea, especially for a personalized circle. Um, because like again, we do a lot that's nature based, and if you're out in nature, to have the closest connection and best connection to everything that's around you when you're casting your circle, would it not be better to take from the land, the layout of the land, and understand what's around you? Because as you can feel it and as you can see it, it'll help you visualize yourself within your circle.
Right. And orient yourself within and feel and have that connection with those elements. Um,
It's a very eclectic thing to do.
right. Exactly. Exactly. And so I feel like, it depends on if you want to be more traditional as far as being in alignment with historically what's been done, or do you want to be more personalized within yourself and your surroundings? And there is no right or wrong. I think that's the thing that people need to remember. There are general rules and guidelines when it comes to magic, and there's things that will help you and help you amplify that energy and that magic. But ultimately, it's up to you.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. Um, I have like that was one of my big things is like incorporating the elements with your circle. Is it necessary to,
Mm.
to have each element in its specific place?
Ah, gotcha. Okay.
Um, and because everything that I find in my research is earth is north, air is east,
Right.
fire is south, water is west.
Right.
But whenever you personalize and really take into consideration the layout of the land and everything that's around you, then it could actually change your elemental calls.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think it goes down to like, how do you connect with that element itself
Yeah.
too?
And so, like, thinking about it, even if, fire was in the West, it, if you, in your elements, or in your surroundings, have, the sun setting at the time of you casting your circle, well, if the sun's in the West, call it from the West, like, call fire from the West. It, if you're doing a sunrise ritual, call it from the East. Um, But what what about, the traditionalism behind calling it from each specified area?
So, and I think we've already talked about, we're going to have to do maybe a part 3. So I'll touch on that briefly. There's a few things to remember. One, I would say if you're trying to figure out which one works best for you, try both ways. Try the traditional way, with earth in the north, air in the east, fire in the south, water in the west. See what kind of results you get. See what kind of energy you feel. See what kind of response you get. If it feels right, then continue with it. But if you already have a certain relationship with the elements or within your surroundings, try it that way and see what kind of results you get. See what kind of energy comes back. See if your rituals, your spells come to fruition faster, or do they take longer, or do they not happen at all? Like, test it out and decide for yourself which one works right for you. I think it would be totally fine to test it out different ways. But the importance, I feel like, comes into play if you're wanting to tap into what has traditionally been done, right? And you're wanting to tap into some of the foundations that have already been laid, right? So we're not reinventing the wheel. That's what we have to remember, because as this energy has been raised and these witches around the world, around the globe, if they're following this similar pattern, they're laying a foundation for you, which makes it easier for you to walk that path. The energy is already there and readily available. Essentially, you just have to open the door to it and tap into it. So there is that potential as well. The other thing is, the more you do it, the more power it has. The more you're laying that groundwork to reconnect faster and faster and faster. So I would caution, unless you're very much somebody that's just in the moment and just casting that circle because you want that energetic container, then you can do whatever you want, call them wherever you want. Outside of that, if you're somebody that's taking it a very ritualistic approach to it, I would really recommend doing it the same time, doing it the same way every time, because you're building that connection with that point and that element. You're building that relationship. And like Ramasi points out, it is a gateway. It's an elemental gateway. And you can't just uproot this gateway and move it and think the element's going to move with it. So that's something to consider. They're also portals. They're portal points. And that definitely comes up later. And as we go through, it'll make more sense. But it is a point in which you can potentially connect with things through that. First point of connection being that element. Other points of connection can come from that. So he also mentions that within these gateways and these portals, this is where we come up with this idea of a watcher, that there's a watcher at this portal. There's somebody that stands guard at this elemental gateway. And we get the idea of what's called watchtowers. And the watchtowers, which are these guardians to these portals, to these realms, for these elements, right? they're old. There's power there. They've been established. So I think it's important to keep that in mind if you're wanting to create a circle and tap into what's already there, but if that doesn't matter to you, which it doesn't have to, you can switch it up like this other guy did. Like you're more than welcome to do that. We are presenting the information to you to make your own decision.
Yep. As a matter of fact, I completely forgot about the watchtowers. I'm not even gonna lie. It's been so long since I've just dove into, the aspects of the magic circle, and let's be honest, it's been a long time since I've cast one. That I completely forgot about the watchtowers, and as soon as you started saying it, I was like, "Oh, yeah, no, completely forgot." Oops.
Right. So, and for some people that might be a brand new concept, but it's something to explore. And that's the whole thing that I want to dive more into. And when we get into part 3 are these portals, these gateways, and what you can do with them and how you can develop them and how they help you and how they help you develop the magic within yourself. So the circle's a lot more than just this energetic container and safe space in which to work. There's a lot more that goes into it. But we're giving you the basics to start out with, and how much you want to take on or how deep you want to dive with it is totally optional and up to you. Every individual is different. To some people, none of it matters. To other people who want to become adept at their craft, all these details are very important. So, but they are, as Grimassi says here, they open directly to astral dimensions. And that's where these watchtowers come into play. And when I wrote my personal circle casting many, 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 many moons ago, I did incorporate the watchtowers, and I did connect with them and call on them as well as the elements. And that was written into my original casting and calling the quarters that I did. But again, everybody's different. So, but I think it was something important that we hadn't talked about that I did come across, that I felt like it was really important to share as far as what he had to say. The other thing he had to say as far as crossing that border, which I think we did touch on a little bit before, is you don't want to go outside that circle once you've cast it. And I like what he said, so I wanted to share a little bit more about why that is and why it's important to stay inside that circle. I know we talked about that, we clear it and we call in what we want and it keeps things out. But he says that crossing the barrier can cause physical harm and energetic harm once you've created it. And it's because your aura or your astral body gets thrown between the energy fields when you step outside of that barrier you've created. And he says a lot of that, especially if you're not energy sensitive, some people are very energy sensitive. If you cross that barrier, you can feel that zap, that zing, that pain instantly. And you're like, oh, shouldn't have done that. Some people are not energy sensitive and they can't feel it, but it can manifest later, show itself later up in the body. And the example he gave is like radiation exposure. When you first are exposed to radiation, you might not even know it because you don't feel it, you don't see it, you have no idea. But then later your body manifests signs of, being sick or all the negative things that go along with that. So it is something, if you're going to work with inside that circle, you need to stay inside that container. And that's why it really does help to lay down that physical barrier that you can see, and have that marker that you can visually see so that you don't accidentally go outside of it. I also ran across, which we'll get into, cutting a door. There's there's several different ways that I came across of how to cut a door.
Many different.
So what I found interesting is there's several different ways to do it, but everybody has a way of doing it.
Yes. The the common one that I came across is, well, there's two of them. One is like cutting a slit in a tent and pulling it back using an athame,
Okay.
and then to close it after cutting from top to bottom, you go with your athame from bottom to top to close it back. The other is literally like cutting out a rectangular shape that will fit your body through it, um, as it is a doorway, so
Right.
that you can pass through it, and then you go the opposite direction to close it
Right.
you
Yeah.
did before. Um, so what with the doorway itself? Again, we understand why the doorway is necessary based off of what you've said. You know, the issues with the astral body and physical body being brought into place, but again, this goes into the why is it necessary? uh,
Okay.
so, and in the physical aspect of your circle, when you cut a door, do you actually want to open that physical aspect as well?
Okay. Good questions. Good questions. I feel like I might have some answers. Um, well, I'll start with what Gramassi says, his way of cutting a door. And he says to cut a door that you insert two athames crossed over each other and you cross them and you cut them through the physical barrier on the floor. And once you go through, you then slide them apart. And by sliding them apart, that creates the width of your doorway. Um, he says that the reason you use the athames is they are a fire tool and they are transformative. So you're transforming that energy space and you're transforming it back to what you need it to be. And that it essentially creates a tunnel through the energies to the material realm.
Okay.
So by doing that, you're slicing in and creating a tunnel that will let you pass through into the material realm without being affected by all those astral energies within where your sphere is hovering in those non-physical realms. So from there, a charged sword or wand is then placed between the two athames to guard the doorway
Okay.
to keep unwanted energies from being able to come in.
Yeah. Okay. That was a curiosity thing on my part personally. Is like, okay, when you cut this door, what you're technically doing is you are opening the outside world into your spiritual space.
Right.
So how would you stop that from allowing? And like, of course, I just take it for granted in a lot of cases that it's the energy that's flowing within that circle
Right.
will help keep it out. But having having
Right.
an understanding of how energy flows, like, no, that's not always the case. You let
Right.
stuff in and you let stuff out.
You
Uh,
also let stuff out. Yes.
and
Yeah.
so yeah, having the charged uh wand or staves uh for the doorway makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. I had actually not heard that before either. So I found that interesting. I'd heard Oberon Zell talk about crossing the athames and pulling them apart as a way that you can cut a door. I did not know Gramassi also recommended that, but I really had never heard about placing that extra barrier to guard the energies from moving in and out. So I found that really interesting and I think it's really helpful. Obviously, you don't want to cut a door unless you absolutely have to, which is why you want to be properly prepared and make sure you have everything you need within the space before you cast that circle. But there are some circumstances where it's inevitable. Like you got to do it. Like
This is
You're
when I need
trying to
that
light
poster.
your candles and you don't have a matches or lighter, and like, what are you gonna do?
Yeah, this is when I need that poster.
Right.
I
Yes.
Shit happens.
This shit
Uh,
happens. It's gonna
so,
happen. So
so
the next thing he says is then you also need to establish the height of this tunnel.
mhm,
So you've cut the slit
mhm.
and you've placed the barrier. He says then a wand is used to establish the height. So you touch with the wand the ground inside the athame. So you're going to touch kind of like at the center where you've crossed. You know, you've got the two laid and you've got the crossing sword or wand, and you'll use another wand to then touch the point of the ground and pull up from the ground to however high you need to be able to walk through, and that will essentially like pull up to create. So you've got the bottom and then you're going to come up and then like part it like a curtain to create the height of this tunnel that will then go through. And then once you walk through, he recommends you walk through 3 spaces and then lower the wand back down to essentially close the door behind you. Then you will repeat the process to come back in. Then once you're done and you've pulled your wand back down, once you're down, you're in, close it back down. You will then slide the 2 athames back together and pull them in, essentially completely shutting off and closing that door. But I liked the idea and the visual of a tunnel versus
Mhm.
a door. I felt like that really helped.
Yeah, it helps bring depth to your circle.
Right. Yeah. I found that really helpful.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, especially whenever you're talking about, you know, it's not just that one single line.
Right.
You have that extra bit. So yeah,
Right. And you're essentially in a sphere. So you have to like figure out, you know, how does all of this, how do you take a ball and cut a space in it that you can walk through? Without
very
messing anything up.
very carefully.
Right. So obviously, some of that might be hard. That's really a group setting situation. So his alternative for doing it as a solitary would be use your athame and wand crossed, create the space, and then you can actually use um, salt to draw a line between the two to create that barrier, um, which I also had never heard that before either. So because if you don't have that many tools, right? Like if you have multiple people in a circle, you got a lot more tools that you're working with because everybody will probably have their athame on them or possibly their wand on them. They're carrying their tools with them. So, but if you're by yourself, you got to work with what you have. So, crossing that wand and athame, pulling them apart, and then using salt to draw that protective barrier. Um, and then you actually use those two, you pick them up from the ground and you use the two and pull them up and then together to create the height of that tunnel to then be able to walk through. Walk your 3 paces, turn around, put them back down, leave them placed on the ground while you go do what you need to do, come back, pick them up, pull them back up at the top, walk through, turn around, put them down, pull them back together and into your circle. And that's how you would essentially cut a door. So I thought that was a great way that he recommended. There are some other ways that I found, but I felt like in my research, that was one of the best ways that I found.
Yeah.
Oberon Zell mentions another one closer to what you were talking about with the tent.
Mhm.
Um,
And I kind of got the directions backwards. So you would actually start from the bottom, cut up to open, and then start at the top and go down to seal. And in that instance, you would actually not. So if you did a physical barrier of like salt for your circle,
right,
you would not disturb the salt. It's very important not to disturb the salt in that instance because that is what is helping keep all your energies in and out.
right,
The stuff that you don't want is staying out. Stuff that you want in is there. and the salt helps keep it there.
Right.
Uh, so if you end up, disturbing it as you are cutting, just kind of make sure you fix that ASAP.
Right. Right, exactly. Yeah, Oberon Zell mentions it as comparing it to like a zipper.
Yes, that is the most common thing that I have heard.
Okay.
Because you think of it as it's hard to imagine cutting something, one way and then just bringing it all back together.
Right, right,
But if you imagine a zipper
right.
and you're unzipping and then zipping it back, it's a lot easier to imagine for and visualize for anyone that needs to do it.
Right. I think it's funny that you had heard that way the most, and I had actually not heard that until I read it in my research from Oberon. I had not heard that way. I was most familiar with either crossing, and cutting that way, or like we talked about, which I don't think I heard anybody mention this one, but actually cutting the shape of
Yes.
the door. Um, which,
That,
thinking about it now, how Gramasi explained it, it seems like you're really leaving it wide open. Like you don't have that barrier covered at the bottom, necessarily. And it just
it,
leaves you more to ponder when you're thinking about it. Like, okay, I'm gonna cut this open, but then like it's wide open. What's protecting this barrier here?
yes.
Well, yeah, that's
It, like the things you don't think about
right,
is really what catches you. So like again, with the zipper aspect or the tent flap type aspect, again, you don't want to disturb your physical circle
right,
because that is what is actually holding everything, as I stated. But if you're doing the actual shape of a doorway, yeah, you're covering height and cutting a door and so on and so forth, but you also have to cross that physical barrier, and you now have this giant gaping hole,
right,
and it's
right,
like, okay, the tent flap, I understand there's a little bit more that could, keep it all together, but you just cut this giant hole,
right. This huge
and
tunnel, like
you have not set any kind of boundaries to keep things in or out.
right,
And so Grimrossi stating the charged wands as the protection basically to keep it all where it needs to be was a phenomenal aspect that I was just like, wow, okay, yes, I I will do what I can.
well, even the salt line,
Yes,
because when you hear about people cutting that door, they never mention laying anything at the bottom. They never mention pouring salt as that barrier to protect between the spaces. None of that's mentioned. They're just like, hey, start at the bottom, cut a big, archway from one
I,
side to the other and step through. And it's like,
yeah,
okay,
I want to see Grimrossi's explanation done physically in front of me because again, you cut that you cut that doorway, and you take 3 paces out before turning around and closing it back while you're outside of it. And I'm just like curious to see it worked.
right.
To
Well, and the thing is, you plan ahead too as you're putting those cross points through and separating. Once you start to separate, you've got somebody else ready to lay that barrier. So
right,
once that barrier's set, even once you're walking through, that barrier still is energetically there to help,
right.
until you can turn around, close it back down, and then doing the reverse to come back in. But yeah, a lot of times when you hear people talk about cutting that doorway, that archway, you don't hear about any other protection measures. So I thought it was great information to just throw out there for people. Because if you don't cut that doorway and you're just like, well, first off, like if you're just recently sold on even using a circle, right? Like you're probably not sold on cutting a door. Like it's just not something that you're thinking about. And so not only are you potentially letting all kinds of stuff in, all that whatever you've already done with inside the circle, you just let it all out.
Yep.
So it really is an important piece so that the hard work that you've done in creating that circle, especially if you go through the process of creating your own ritual for doing a circle, like you just keep waste all that hard work and energy. So it really is valuable information. So hopefully that's helped somebody out there. Okay, so next up I've got DJ Conway. She's done quite a few books. And the one I went to was, of course, my first book I ever had, Celtic Magic, circa 1990.
Oh
Yes,
man, 1990.
1990. So she says, before you even do anything, as far as creating this circle, right? She says you need to prepare for magic. And some key things that you need are self-discipline, concentration, focus, visualization, and meditation. Those are some of your key pieces that you really have to have in place before you approach casting, cutting, calling, whatever, a circle. Those are key. They really are, because if you don't have the concentration and focus to hold that circle space while it's there, to energetically feel that and maintain that, if you don't have the self-discipline to know your ritual, whether it's one you made or you're following somebody else's, like if you don't have the self-discipline enough to be on top of that, anything could go awry, Plus, you have to have that visualization piece. You are, or you can create that visual barrier that you can see, but ultimately you need that visualization piece to give it that energy to establish it between the worlds. Like that's the necessary piece. So visualization really is big. And then of course we've already talked about how important meditation is. So we won't get back into that, but I just think that it's I feel like it's important to bring that up. So if you want to work your little spells or charms or whatever, like, and you're not ready to do a circle yet because you don't have these pieces, that's fine. Like we've talked about the pros and cons of that. And your spell work is probably going to reflect some of that. So if you want to strengthen what you're doing, these are some key points to work on.
Absolutely.
So I feel like, yeah, that was another thing that she mentions that's very important is to have a working understanding of your elements, your colors, your time of day, your seasons, your elementals, the associations, the qualities, the expressions, your tools, your ritual tools. And then it can go even further into your celestial bodies, your negative associations, the emotions, the energy, all of those, because they do come into play when it comes to your cardinal points and calling those quarters.
So this seems like a good point to ask. When you're casting a circle, what tools are needed?
Okay. Yeah.
With the whole thing of making sure that you have the understanding of your tools and so on and so forth. Okay, but what tools are needed to
Right.
actually cast? Um, and I know certain things for your altar are necessary. If you're bringing your altar into your circle, or if you're casting around your circle, you want certain things on your altar for representation of your elements, such as, a bowl of salt for earth, and incense, some incense for air, um, a candle for your fire, and a bowl of water for water.
Right.
Um, but, you know, we also have talked about having a wand or an athame in your circle. And are these things 100% needed for casting?
Great questions. I would say when doing the research and going to the books, again, because everybody should know by this point, I'm kind of oath bound, so I can't share my knowledge here that I have acquired, but I can share the research that I have found in the books, and then try to give my hints and opinions as best I can. Um, so the things you just listed, I feel like are repetitively mentioned as necessities. And oftentimes, not only are they placed on the altar, which is typically in the center of your circle.
Mhm.
That's what I found over and over and over. You place the altar in the circle of your center of your circle. And there's some debate as to which direction it faces. A lot of people face it in the east. A lot of people face it in the north. And I'll cover that as I come to it and let you know who says what on that point. But yes, those are all key things. The incense, the salt, the water, a candle, at least one. Um, those four things are over and over and over and repeated. And depending on where you have your altar, where you place them on the altar should be in alignment with your cardinal point directions and the elemental association. That being said, we'll get into several people that I have read mention using those tools to cast your circle.
Okay.
And those are even used potentially for some people in place of an athame or a wand.
And see, that was what I was curious about, because I've seen it done both ways.
Right.
I've
Yes.
I've seen you use, your representation of your elements to cast,
Yep.
as well as not having the elements, not even having an altar in the center,
Okay.
um, but having a kind of representation towards
Okay.
the outside of the circle, but using a wand or an athame to actually cast and create the circle.
Okay. Okay. I could see that. That's the thing. It varies so much. And that's why I'm presenting what I have found and letting people decide what they want to do, how they want to create theirs. But yes, I've seen commonly over and over and over again. A lot of what you see is the athame used because it is associated with fire. It's that transformation. Um, it's also typically made of steel or a similar type metal that you're using to really cut that barrier. So when we talk about cutting a circle, I feel like that's typically done with the athame
Mhm.
because you're using that blade with the intention of drawing that line and cutting that circle. Um, when a wand is used, the wand is associated with air. So that's that air element. And you are essentially drawing the space in the air with
Mhm.
the air tool. So it's, more of that. You're drawing a circle. You could consider that casting a circle because you're throwing that intention with the mental aspect of air. You're throwing that barrier down mentally with that air wand
Yeah.
connection. So you can use a wand, or you can also just use your finger. You can use your dominant hand finger to direct your energy and your intention of again, drawing or casting or laying that circle.
Right. So using your, again, dominant projective hand
Yes.
pointing and allowing that to essentially be your wand.
Right.
Um, and it's funny that you're like, oh, yeah, drawing the circle with the wand because of the air element. And I'm like, here I am forgetting yet again, our tools have associated elements. So, it's before the way that I did things before um, my hiatus was at best shoddy. Um, without okay, so you're just starting out. You're trying to get into understanding how it all works, and you don't have all the information necessary at times. And so
Right.
the way that I visualized it was more of the energy flowing into me, through me to the wand, out the wand, and creating the energetic barrier without associating the elements. And now I'm like, oh yeah, that's that's why it felt shaky. Because you don't have that full understanding. And like
Right.
at first you think it's cool because you can feel the vibrations or sense the vibrations in one way or another. But then you start getting that better understanding of the elements that are with the tools that you're using. And it's like,
Right.
oh, that probably actually makes it more solid. You
Well,
don't-
yeah, and definitely. And then, like, too, when you go into calling the quarters, you're bringing in more of that elemental energy and you're fortifying, as well. And that's where you see the people, casting the circle with the elements that you mentioned, the elemental tools mentioned on the altar. So that's another one that I saw of people actually taking the incense and it's setting the intention of creating that air barrier, then taking the salt and laying the salt of that earth barrier, walking the circle with a candle to create that fire barrier, and then going behind and sprinkling it with water to create that water barrier and literally pulling in and creating that circle out of the elements. And when they did that, on the ones that I saw, they did not use an athame. They did not use a wand. They did not use their finger. They just simply used those elemental tools to create that barrier and create that circle. So that's also an option. But I think that goes back to DJ Conway's point of having that working understanding of the elements, having that working understanding of the tools, the associations, the energies, the emotions, like what happens, why are these important, all comes into play. Like, and it's all things to consider when you want to create your own. And like when I look back now, when I was very young and writing how to do my circle, right? Like I was just really, I was like, gosh, I don't know, 20, like really young. And I didn't have a full understanding of the elements. I didn't have a full understanding of the energies. I didn't have a full understanding. I was just like, this is what we do. And so I'm doing it, right? Like I'm going to do it the right way because obviously that's who I am, still am today. But when I look back and I look at what I did and what I created and how it works for me now, it's crazy. It's crazy. Like my circle casting shit was on point and I didn't even know it. Like I didn't even understand it at the time. And now it's like, and I used it over and over and over again, which helped fortify those energies, bring in that repetitive, lay that foundation, right?
Mhm.
Lay down those portal lines by continuously calling those watchtowers and the elements and those portals in, right? Like having no real sense of really what I was calling in or the energies that I was calling in or what I was doing. That, now looking back, I'm like, that's a damn good circle casting I came up with. Like that's some hot shit right there. And it works. Like, so even if you feel like I don't know what I'm doing, you are not alone. Like that's where I started, but I honestly, I don't think I would even make that many tweaks. Like if I was to go back and really like taking the knowledge that I have now,
I
you know,
mean,
on this
I
side,
know, I know, I would make so many tweaks. It would just have to be a whole new thing for me. Um, but of course, I was doing a lot of this in secret anyway.
right,
So it's, you know, I had an understanding of energy and the way it moved and flowed. I
right,
understood that, you know, I'm a tool for the flow of energy. I'm not making this energy happen. I'm
right,
just letting it in and telling it where to go and directing it in how I want it to be directed, and
right.
it's just going to flow. And now it's like, man, I really got to buckle down on my studies. But I also didn't have availability to a whole lot of information either.
Right.
So,
And that's one thing I did have. I had a whole lot of books of resources and I just pulled from all of them and created something that I could connect with that made me feel magical, that made me feel like I was doing something. When I didn't realize to what extent at the time. Um, but I had a lot of really good results actually, for not knowing shit about shit. Like I did some things, but hey, it worked out.
I also have to say, like, even for me, when I was doing my own personal circles, because again, a lot of what I got was information from other people
Right.
instead of, you know, actual physical text that could teach me how to do it. But when I was doing things by myself, I actually had a lot better results than I did working with these other people because it was a lot of confusing information all at one time
Right.
versus going based more off of my intuition and understanding,
Yes.
um, and just, you know, working my craft at that point. Um,
Right.
so it helped doing it by myself, but I guarantee it's not nearly as strong as it could have been. Because again, you still feel that vibrational shake on the outside of your circle,
Right.
instead of like that solid wall of, you know, this is your space. You have
Right.
claimed it now.
Yeah. So while I say I wouldn't tweak too many things as far as what I had, I wouldn't change too many things, but I would add a lot. Let me say that. I wouldn't necessarily change or take away from what I've got because I feel like it's powerful and it's strong, especially at this point for how long I've used it. But I definitely, with the knowledge I have now, would add a lot more to strengthen, um, to fortify, to bring more in. So there's that aspect as well. Like I would add a lot for sure. I would definitely say that.
Okay.
So we were talking about like where to start and where to finish. So DJ Conway, she suggests using a sword, a dagger, an athame, something like that. So that's her go-to. And she suggests starting and finishing in the east. Um, and she says a traditional circle is 9 foot in circumference. I think she meant diameter because everywhere else I've seen it written, it's 9 foot diameter,
Yeah.
not circumference. So
Yeah.
I think she maybe had that wording wrong at the time.
Yeah. A 9 foot circumference is actually a very small circle.
Right. Right.
9 foot
Uh,
diameter makes it a bit bigger.
yeah. Yeah. So, but she does say, where we talked about before, where Grimassi mentioned a circle within a circle, she does mention the possibility of doing two circles because she was saying a traditional circle is 9 foot in diameter, and sometimes a 10-foot one is cut outside of that one, and that your elemental candles and or symbols are placed in between the two circles.
Yeah.
So that one was interesting. I kind of understand the concept. I haven't really. well, I have seen it a couple other places, but not so specific as to
I almost feel like I've seen it done. It,
probably,
it's
yes.
it's kind of it was it's kind of like a hit right now. Like I, I feel like I've seen it, but I don't think I've actually physically seen it within this life, kind of thing.
Okay. Gotcha. So what was mentioned was some of the older circles, like going back like to Stonehenge and some of those. You see circles within circles sometimes.
Hmm.
And a lot of times they are marked by the standing stones. And sometimes they are marked literally, they are cut or dug into the ground. So, and there's that physical circle, and then another one, and then another one. And there are certain markers at the cardinal points. Um, so you do see that a lot, circles within circles. And I think that gives us more of that concept of projecting even further out and having that understanding of the depth and that dimension of the circle and that idea of you are with going within a space that is in between. And I think that's why back then they did 2 or 3 layers of circles to help establish that, okay, this is our first marker moving from, point A to point B to point C, and projecting out into the astral. Um, and that's something that's been done, way, way, way long ago. So I found that interesting. But really, she does mention, and everybody does mention across the board, your circle can be any size.
Hmm.
So there are guidelines like the 9 foot. Um, some people and some other people in here mention others, and I'll get to that. But ultimately, it's all they all say it can be any size. It really has to fit you, your space, where you're at, whether you're indoors, whether you're outdoors. It has to fit your needs.
Yes.
So that's really what it comes down to. But then she talks about having that concentration, the visualization, and trying to make sure that you have everything you need inside. Um, she mentions having your altar in the middle facing east, but she does also mention you can change the direction if you want to. She does say use your dominant hand. And she says as you're doing the circle, you start in the east. And she says to visualize a blue silver flame creating the circle. And then you end where you began, overlapping a little bit to make sure you fully get that circle encompassed. So that's one thing that she mentioned. Another thing that was mentioned and is repetitively mentioned, but she mentioned it first in my research, was that it's important for you to flow in the direction that the energy is flowing within the circle. And she's also one that talked about the direction of cutting the circle. So I would say the majority of people that I read always talk about going in a clockwise manner.
Hmm.
She does mention moving in a clockwise manner for positive magic or a counterclockwise direction for cursing or diminishing magic. So if that's something you're into, something you want to explore, something to keep in mind. But just about everybody else I've read, they stay in the clockwise position.
Yes.
Um,
That also brings to question, like, if it is a circle to bring things in, moving in a clockwise direction
right,
to help bring it into your circle, whether it's, healing, um, or just trying to bring in spiritual enlightenment, whatever you're trying to bring in,
right,
moving in that clockwise direction versus if it is going to be something that you are pushing out,
right.
you could,
Diminishing or banishing.
right, you could move in that counterclockwise direction for cutting. And it makes a lot of sense in a way. But
Right.
yes, the most common thing is for, you know, to go in your clockwise direction when cutting your circle or casting your circle. So,
And then taking that the step further of all motions within that space stay in that. So if you are in the west and you need to move to the east, you don't walk straight across. You don't walk counterclockwise. You always move within the circle, within the direction. Even if you're just turning within your singular point, you turn in the direction of which you cut your circle. You never want to go opposite because that is pushing the energy backwards. You want to keep the energy and the flow that you're creating. And a lot of people mentioned thinking of it as almost like that tunnel or a tornado, or one person even mentioned it, compared the circle as a creating a vortex. So you don't want to move against that energy. You want to make sure you're always flowing in the same direction of which it's all supposed to be going.
think of a snow globe. If
Right.
you if you can, you know, spin it in one direction for quite a bit of time and then stop moving it, everything inside of it will continue to move in that one direction. But
Right.
if you start trying to spin it in the opposite direction,
Oh yeah.
it starts messing everything up.
Everything just kind of
And it
goes
just,
crazy.
yeah, it basically just stops and falls.
Right. Right.
So that's kind of my visualization on it. So if you're moving in one direction, keep moving in that direction to keep the flow going, and then when you get to the point of releasing, that's when you will move in the opposite direction.
Right. It reminds me of when Shannon and I went up to Starwood and they were doing the opening ceremony, and they had us, turn in the directions as they were calling the quarters. And we were turning, and I turned around because she was beside me, and we're turning, and she started to turn the wrong way, and I was like, ooh, ooh. It's like, no, go that way. It was just funny.
Turn the other way. Turn the other way.
Right? Like, no, everybody's going that direction. Don't be the one oddball going the wrong way. And so I quickly course corrected. Remind me of that. But yeah, you want to make sure you're always going that way. Um, the next thing she mentioned is when you're done, of course, and everybody does this differently, but she says you dismiss the elements, and in her opinion, you cut the circle backwards or in reverse to open it.
Yep. The very common thing that I've come across as well.
Now, she also says that you don't even have to, and this I think goes more to that mindset of keeping things moving in the right direction. Because she says if you take your sword, dagger, athame, wand, whatever, and you point it at that barrier and go backwards, you only have to do it for a small section and the whole circle falls. You do not have to walk the entire circle backwards to open it.
Thinking about it, because it is energy based, that is very, very accurate. I would also say you still want to walk. You still want to walk the whole thing, or at least turn in the opposite direction as you thank and release your elements and your watchtowers and all that. Just
Right.
as you're opening your circle back up, you still want to move in the opposite direction to release. But yeah, like just cutting part of it basically stops that flow
Right.
because it ends the connection.
Right. So I think it just gives a kind of a bit of a feel and a visual as to the importance of moving everything in the direction in which you start the energy flow. That one bit of disruption in the wrong direction can, as she says, it will cause all of the circle to wink out.
Yes.
So it's just gone.
Think of it as I said before, a bubble
Yeah. You pop the
popping
bubble.
bubble.
Yeah. So that's one interesting thing to consider and helps bring all that full circle. But that's her way of closing or opening that circle. So next I have Oberon Zell. And this is from Grimoire for the Apprentice Wizard. And he says that the circle should be an odd number of feet in diameter. I don't know how important that is. He's the only one that I found that mentioned that it be an odd number, but everybody else did mention odd numbers, though they didn't specify that it had to be an odd number.
So the odd number thing allows you to have a direct center.
Which makes sense.
So yeah, it makes a whole lot of sense to have an odd number of feet
Right.
for the diameter so that you can have an actual true direct center. But that would be about the only reason why I would figure that would be necessary.
Well, I've also heard, and I could be wrong on this one, so don't quote me, but I have heard along the way that odd numbers are numbers of change and transformation.
I'll have to do some research into that because I like the concept.
Where even numbers keep things the same, but odd numbers are meant for transformation. So, and I remember that because I remember, and I don't know if it was mentioned in a podcast or not, but in my own research, that a lot of times if you're doing spell work to change or transform something, you want to have an odd number of materials, an odd number of, whatever you're working with, if you're using herbs or oils or whatever, the total is an odd number because you want to create that change or transformation.
Sorry, I'm over here thinking about how numbers are commonly written and how that can actually align. Okay, so the number 1 is a straight line.
Right.
The number 2 can be written in 2 common ways, but the most common way that I see it written is curve up top, come down, loop back, and through itself for the
Right.
number, which allows for the connection and continuation of it,
Right.
so that everything is connected still within there. 3 is again a number that is left open as a single kind of curved line in 2 spaces. 4 is connected at the top, out, and down.
Right. True. Yeah.
5 is open. 6 is connected.
Yeah.
7 is open. 8 is connected. And 9 is the only one that is an odd number that is connected.
But 9.
But it is also finality.
Right. Right.
So,
9 is a final, and there's so much more that goes into 9. Like divisible amongst itself, like, all the crazy things that people can do with the number 9.
We're doing a numerology episode at some point. I'm writing this down.
Okay. That's what's come out of this. We're going to figure this out. This is going to be fun because I was actually doing some birthday numerology stuff, and this will be a fun thing to share. But when I start to reduce my birthday, the numbers that come out are 3, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 3. They mirror themselves.
Okay.
It's crazy. And I found that the other day when I was going through my notes for all this stuff, and I was like, that's crazy. Like, what does that even mean? And I never did do research on it. So it gives me research. Yes. And my number is 9. They all come back to 9.
Okay.
So
yeah.
Interesting. Anyway, totally off topic, but yeah, we'll have to figure out what that means too when we do the numerology.
Yeah, that's a
little tangent, but it's fun. Yeah, I just was like, what the crap is this? And then I was like, oh shit, that's my birthday. Okay, so yes, he says traditionally, again, 9 foot or 13, but 3 and 5 is okay too, especially if you're solitary with your altar in the center. A lot, he mentions outdoor circles. You can put a fire pit in the middle. and have your altar, aside from that. And the outdoor, it's great to use physical barriers like stones, benches, hedges. Um, I think he mentioned in the book that at one point they used limes. They just bought a bunch of limes and used it to mark the outside circle. So
I
be creative. A lot of things that I find continually mentioned for creating that visual barrier are rope, to lay that down. And there's different techniques to do that, but use rope. One way of drawing the circle is to literally draw it with salt or chalk. That's one that I see often. I don't know how true this is, but one book that I read said that the best material to use to lay the foundation for your circle, again, I don't know how true this is, so don't quote me, but I found it interesting, is to use material that is electrically conductive.
Okay, so like copper wire
Yep.
and
They
different
mentioned
stuff like that.
charcoal, sulfur something or other. Damp salt, not just even salt, but damp salt. So again, I don't know how true that is, but she said it was based on about 50,000 circles that had been cast by, I guess, students of their school. I'm trying to remember. I think it was Gavin and Yvonne Frost. They didn't mention much on the circle, so I didn't pull their information, but that's one of the things that they said that stood out to me was that they had students experiment with circles, and about 50,000 circles in, they found out that the most powerful ones were ones that were laid with barriers with electrical conductive material.
Well, I mean, you think about energy and the idea of what it is.
Right.
One of the ways that it is able to be sensed is the electrical current that we kind of feel that comes with it.
Right.
Um, so it's a good idea. Definitely worthy of being tested in your personal practices for sure. I mean, I'd give it a shot if I had the ability. Damp salt, I could do that one, but
Like I was thinking like maybe outside,
yeah,
if I have, which I am working on creating a permanent outdoor circle space. So it's something to consider. Copper wire would be cool too, but you have to keep people from stealing it. Hopefully
true.
they wouldn't know it was there, but still, you never know.
I'm thinking of ways that it could be done to where it won't be noticed, but
Mm.
still very much there and prevalent.
You definitely don't want to mow over copper wire.
No, no.
That would be bad.
So if you do kind of like a cover for your outdoor ritual space,
Mm.
inside the top of the cover, you can run
That
either
would,
a single piece of just a small gauge copper wire so that it doesn't stand out,
right. It's a good idea.
but still creates that space. And the other thought that I had would be taking three pieces of a small gauge copper wire and kind of braiding it together and then running it in the same fashion
Right.
around the top,
Okay. Yeah.
just to kind of boost the the current. Me and
Right.
copper get along great, so I love copper. Um, but kind of boost the current with the copper that way, and three is a very magical number. Maybe something that we discuss in our numerology episode.
Right.
Um, but yeah, so like having that kind of braided copper wire either around the top or near the bottom. But of course, you obviously wouldn't want to mow over it, and if it is around the bottom, it is more likely to become damaged. So you will want to continue to inspect it, and if it does become damaged, replace it.
Right. That's true too. So again, I don't know how true it is or how relevant it would be. I hadn't heard it anywhere else. I haven't seen that anywhere else. But it might be a fun experiment for people that maybe want to test that idea out.
Yeah,
Especially
definitely.
if it's something that you can do in a smaller circle as a solitary. It might be interesting to test it out. But I thought that was interesting. So let's see, what else do I have here? We talked about all of that. Okay, so now we get into more of like the creating the space. So Oberon Zell in his book, he quotes a woman. Well, I take that back. I don't know that's a woman. I'm assuming it's a woman based on the writing, and she was talking about cooking. It's Anodia Judith. So anyway, we'll leave that there because I'm not sure, but the references sounded more like it was a woman. But anyway, she says the elements that you bring together to create a circle are you create the sacred space, and the circle is the sacred center that forms the psychic boundaries that keep unwanted energies out, allowing for the energy within to be contained until transformation is complete. Seen as a place outside the ordinary stream of time and space, which I don't know if we've touched on that yet, which inevitably influences this mortal stream of time and space. So that's another thing, when you're in that sphere and you're in between the worlds, you are suspended in time and space. You're not confined by time and space, essentially. And the space where the circle is held is purified and consecrated. So that's a key factor over and over and over about the magical circle. Care is taken to be conscious of all the words and actions within the circle space, protecting the sanctity of the circle. So I know I've read in several places, but this one really pointed it out of when you're in the circle, you really want to keep that high vibration. You don't want to bring in the crap from your day. You don't want to bring in negative emotions. You don't want to use any kind of negative or damaging talk. You want to really keep it sacred. You want to keep it holy, essentially. And you want to make sure that you are in that state of mind, that you're ready for the work ahead, that you're ready to commune with the divine. And that's what that space is for, and you keep that sacred. So it's just another thing to consider. Like if you bring negativity into that circle, then your work is probably going to reflect that. Your outcome is probably going to reflect that.
Two things that I have come across as ways to help keep your daily negative energy out of your circle. One, sage yourself before entering or cleanse yourself in some sort before entering your circle. And the second is change your clothes.
Yes.
If it is the same clothes that you have been wearing all day, guess what? Your clothes are carrying that negative energy. So even if you, try and sage yourself and cleanse yourself of that negative energy, some of it can still be clinging on to you and your clothing. So better to take that off, get rid of it, set it aside to be washed, or go ahead and start the wash, whatever, and
Yeah.
cleanse yourself before you enter.
Definitely important. And I know, like, when we talked about tools, one of the things DJ Conway mentioned as a tool was a robe, like a ritual robe. And it's something that you wear only when you're performing magic, only when you're doing a circle, only when you're doing that type of work that really helps you do that mental shift from mundane to magical. But same as you're saying, like the energies that you're carrying with you from the day, taking that off and replacing it so you're not carrying that through. So definitely both are great points. And those are repetitive points that I've seen as well.
It's also a psychological thing.
Yeah.
By shedding the clothes that you've had on all day, you may not even think about it, but subconsciously, if you don't take that off, you're going to feel it. You're
Yeah.
going to catch a glimpse of of it when you're in your circle, and you're going to be reminded of something bad from your day.
Right.
And guess what? There's more bad energy just invited in. So yeah, the robe is definitely one that I've heard of using. I personally do not have one. I just change my clothes, put on
Right.
something clean, fresh, that's not had any kind of negative energy brought into it for that day before practicing.
I do like the idea though of having something that you wear, even if it's not a robe, something that you wear that helps put you into that space that you wear only for magical workings.
Mhm.
I think it's a good idea. Like you said, that psychological factor as well. Um, and you don't wear it other than that. Like you just don't. And that keeps it sacred as well. And that it
Yes.
then becomes part of your magical tools. Even if it's not a robe, it can still be one of your magical tools.
If you're one of those people that want to go skyclad, go for it.
That too. That too. That's an option.
that's that's totally on you. You go for it. I would prefer a robe myself,
Yeah,
but
me too. So then she also goes on to say purifying the space can be done magically by banishing unwanted energies or physically cleaning the space or sweeping the area. Um, you're casting that circle to create that container. She also here mentions that you can make that physical barrier by using chalk again, cornmeal, which I found an interesting one, or salt. Um, and then she also mentions and or using that athame or that wand. And then you invoke the elements, directions, deity, spirit, divine essence. Then you do the workings. Raising energy is something that's been repetitive as well. And I don't know that it's something that we really talked on too much. But once you're in that circle and you've cast that circle and you've called in your quarters, you've pulled in your deity, you've invited into the space what you want to invite in, you can then raise the energy. And she says you want to raise that transformative energy by drumming, dancing, chanting, meditating, just focusing your concentration. And that's something that you will do to help raise that energy up before you do your ritual working or your spell work. Um, the next piece is then bringing the energy back down and grounding it, which is typically done through especially if you're in a group, which it can be done alone. But the group setting is typically your food and drink, also known as cakes and wine. Also, discussing, just having a discussion to help bring the energy back down. Um, if you're alone, some good ideas, things that I like to do in my space are journaling or divination. I always like to read cards before I do spell work just to see, make sure I'm doing the right thing. I'm not missing anything. And then I also like to journal, but everybody knows I'm big on that. Guilty as charged. I'm going to record everything from the date, the time, the moon phase, what I did, what I used, the energy involved. I record all that stuff. And I use that as part of my journaling. And then I also do divination, read some cards after to make sure I feel like things went the way I wanted to, and I'm going to get the outcome I expected. And then I also journal on that reading. So that's what I do to help ground that energy and bring me back down. And then finally, you remove the circle, release the energy, clean the tools, and put everything away. So that's her process. So,
yeah, I think I missed that step many a time as bringing it back down before opening, because I'm very much the taking of libations.
right.
Food and drink is fantastic after doing your spell work and being in your circle. Um, it helps replenish some of that energy that you've used or allowed to be part of the workings that you had going on. And so, yeah, a lot of the times we don't bring that into the circle. Um, and so we end up releasing our circle while we're still in that high energetic state. And when when you open your circle and you release it, you feel that energy just kind of rush away from you.
Right.
Um, which is also one of the reasons why food becomes an absolute necessity afterwards, because it's like, oh, drained immediately. Let me,
Right. Right.
all that just went away. Let me get something to eat and drink, and we'll replenish this energy that I've lost in that instance. But yeah, I think I'll have to start bringing things into my circle.
Yeah.
And it's also good to have as an offering for your deities, or any other area that you want to give offering to. Um,
Yeah, I
which
definitely agree with that. I think that's important. It's your way of saying thank you as well as by giving that offering. And that's something that's mentioned over and over. I think it's a good practice. And, you know, I just feel like it's essential. But I also feel like anytime you do spell work, to me and what I have experienced and learned just in my own, process is that grounding that spell work so that you've raised this energy, you've asked for this help, but then you tether it. You want to tether it into the mundane and ground it so that it has that link to be able to form into the reality and come in that much quicker, and you see it faster when you have that grounding tethering piece,
Mhm.
um, so that it can go out, do what it needs to do, and then follow that link back. um, so that's been important for me. So I think it's and eating is definitely a great way to get grounded. So it's a thing to have.
I love food. I love food.
So that was her piece that Oberon added in his book. And then he goes into a little more in depth, um, like you did. And another person that I want to go ahead and bring into the picture here is Scott Cunningham. So in Scott Cunningham's book, Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner, and in the next book of his, Living Wicca, A Further Guide for the Solitary Practitioner, him and Oberon very much are in line with their process of casting this circle. And both of them say you begin with some kind of self-purification, which is exactly what you touched on. So Scott Cunningham says, have a shower even. And I think that's a common one, to wash off everything from the day. Um, and then also anoint yourself with some kind of oil to help with that shift.
Mhm.
And then Oberon, his way of cleaning the self is with, like you mentioned, that smudge smoke, or to asperge with salt water. So you sprinkle yourself with that salt water. So cleansing the self first seems to be very important, and then clearing the space to banish unwanted energies. And Oberon mentions the same thing for clearing the space, to do smudge, um, or asperge. And Scott Cunningham says the same thing. He doesn't mention the smudging, but he does say to purify the space, you can do the asperging, that sprinkling with that salt water, or sweep, which is another one that was mentioned, using your besom to energetically clear out that space. Oberon then goes into grounding, connecting, centering, which is that meditative piece we've talked about. And then Scott Cunningham says to create sacred space by going ahead and setting up your altar, and preparation for casting that circle. And then you actually cast the circle. And we've talked about the ways of doing that. Oberon's is pretty much the same, only he says that you take your wand or athame and you touch the ground at the east point. Draw up to shoulder level. Walk the circle at shoulder level with your tool, and then go back to the east, touching down at the ground at that point. So that's another way that you can do it. Some people just point the tool at the ground the whole way, never actually touching the ground. I would say it's your choice.
Yeah, it's definitely your choice. Because again, if you take into consideration this is a lot of energy work that is
Right.
happening, your energy is going to be touching the area in which you're pointing if you're using your tool or your finger or whatever. You don't necessarily actually have to touch it, but a physical representation never hurts.
Sure. There is that. Yeah, definitely. So from there, Oberon says you call the quarters, your direction, your elements. We've talked some on that. We can get more into the depth on that next time. But again, you want to be really familiar with those things. Try to familiarize yourself as much as possible. Then you do your invocation, which is inviting your deities, spirits. He also mentions ancestors, fae, angels, animal totems. Those are also things that you could invite into your circle space. I don't think that's something we specifically touched on last time, that you can invite all those things in, but those are some things that you can invite in and ask for that assistance and that energy with whatever you're working on.
Yes, and that's also the things that I was saying that you would also want to leave, some kind of libation or offering for.
Definitely. Yeah, you want to leave something for them, especially with depending on how much stuff you're calling in. I think you want to leave a pretty good offering.
Yeah.
You don't want to shortchange anybody.
You call in the fae, you better have a good offering, okay?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You want some good offerings if you're working with the fae.
They do not take kindly to being slighted. So
no. If things start going missing or just very awry in your life, you've probably pissed off the fae. Just throwing that out there. Scott Cunningham also mentions the invocation and then the raising of energy and ritual. And Oberon goes a little bit more in depth with the working after the invocation. So he says that you should then start with a declaration of intent. So you're clearly stating your intention from the beginning. Then you raise the energy, do your ritual spell work, release the energy, which is all done within that circle space. So like you're releasing that energy, you're asking that it go do what you need it to do, or you're like focusing it to send out, you're directing it into whatever area you're wanting it to go, and then releasing it. And then you center and meditate again. So he gets a little bit more in depth with that. And then Oberon moves into communing. So having the consecration of the food and wine before you actually partake. So he does go into that. And then giving that offering, the libations, the thanking the deities, and then thanking the elements, the deities, releasing them, and then opening the circle. And his way of opening the circle, Oberon, he says to take your wand or athame at the ground and walk with it outside the circle space, walking counterclockwise. So to actually open it up.
Yeah, so that it's actually penetrating the space rather than just touching the space in the same line.
Right.
You penetrate and basically
outside of it to open it up. So that's his way of doing it. Scott Cunningham just goes on to say, earthing the power through cakes and wine, which again, we talked about grounding, creating that center point to come back to, offering gratitude, and then breaking the circle. And I thought, to me, it was interesting. He also talks about using the athame, but this is the only time Scott Cunningham that I found in these books anyway, mentions cutting the circle. And to him, you're actually cutting it in reverse. And you are actually drawing the energy back into the athame. I thought that was an interesting concept. I hadn't heard that.
It is an interesting concept. I've not heard of that either. I don't know how I personally feel about that. I kind of like the idea, but at the same time, it's like it's almost similar to going in a counterclockwise direction if you have been moving clockwise the entire time.
Right.
Disruption of the energy, but if you're using your receptive hand to do this,
right, that would make sense.
then yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
He doesn't specify, so I found that interesting.
I feel like that would be the only way that it would really make a whole lot of sense to me. But again,
Right.
what do I know? I'm still basically new to this.
I did find that Scott Cunningham was very cryptic when it came to the circle. He did not give a lot of details. He left it very open to interpretation. He left it very open to the imagination to be creative and leave it up to you. So he did not go as far into detail as I feel like later people did. And maybe that's just because he was one of the early pioneers on writing some of this stuff and he felt like he needed to keep still some secrecy.
Yes. Well, I mean, also think about like the situation you're in. You
Right,
can get the information from the books that you find.
right, right.
But on the other hand, there's certain things that you have to keep secret. So,
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And there's quite a few overlap. Um, some things are still very different, but there is a lot of overlap. And then I find that I feel like there's little bits from everywhere that go into the whole. Um, so again, take what you feel like you said, intuitively makes sense when you're creating your own process for this. But I feel like the repetition is important as well, for sure. Um,
yes.
in Scott Cunningham's later book, he did go a little bit more into detail of a traditional circle. And for this one, he mentions purifying the area, setting up the altar, lighting the candles and incense. You then consecrate the water, bless the salt, and then you do the actual magical creation of the circle through 4 steps. And that's where we get into one, you sprinkle salt around the circle using that earth element. Carry the incense around the circle with that air element. Carry the flaming candle around for the fire element, and then sprinkle water around for that water element. And that was what he listed as doing a traditional circle. And so at no point in time in that traditional circle did he talk about using a wand, an athame, your finger, anything to draw, cut, cast. Everything was done with those elemental tools, but they were not used until they were consecrated or blessed.
I have seen that done in a group setting where one person at each of the cardinal points
Uh-huh.
has
Their element.
the element,
Yeah.
and the whole circle moves walking around the circle
At the same
at
time.
the same time, while those who have the elements are actually basically consecrating the circle and creating the circle, casting the circle with the elements
Now that would
in
be cool to
one
see
full motion.
in motion. That would be really cool to see in motion, I do believe. I
It,
like I could visualize that and it sounds like an extremely cool concept. And it's not like there's one thing happening in order because they are all happening at the same time. And I feel like
correct.
there's a power within that as well that I feel like is
Yes, very much. And there is when you see all of that happening at one time, you understand how they all work together
yes.
in one moment. It is amazing. And of course, you're
How
walking
was
the whole
the
circle.
energy of that circle?
It felt more solid. It felt like, and because everybody was moving at one time,
Right.
that also raised energy at the exact same time.
Right.
So by the time that you reached your starting point as your ending point,
Right.
you could feel it had really, it had a very strong, just barrier between you and the outside world.
Right. I love
But
that.
you felt the energy raise at the exact same time, and it all came together in that bubble-esque sphere.
Right. Right.
It was awesome.
It sounds awesome. Like I'm visualizing it and I'm like, That would be so cool to see and feel in motion and
I
experience that. I
I would
love
of course do it. I would do it in a smaller circle, because me and a whole lot of people just
it.
it just it eh,
A lot of potential for clashing energies.
yeah. But like with a select few, me and three others would be perfect.
Right,
Maybe five,
right,
depending.
right.
Um, but
I can
to
see you doing it in a setting where you had maybe like your high priestess in the center, or maybe your high priest and priestess in the center.
yes, your high priest and priestess in the center,
And then
and
you
then
have your people at the quarters, which I
mhm,
also saw quite a bit of like I think Oberon mentioned it too, that like if you are in that group setting, you have a person that is dedicated to learning their element and their quarter, their direction, and they call that one every time
yes,
and they connect to it so that you have that strength and that power that that person has made with that connection with that portal, gateway, watchtower, element, direction, and they can fully bring that through. And so you're dedicated and focused just to that one rather than being solitary and having to split the energies to try to make that connection with each one, which I still think there's a lot of value in. But I can see how in a group setting, having somebody that has specialized in that direction pull that energy in can bring a lot of power to it. But then
absolutely.
being how they've connected to that element and everybody walking that circle, full circle at the same time with that element, how yes, they can not have to worry about which one am I supposed to do first? Did I do all the steps right? Like, no, they know their shit, they're on it. I'm a fire sign, so I'll say, I've got fire, I've got this, and I'm focused on walking this circle and raising that element around it.
Mhm.
Um, and everybody doing that in that same focus and energy be really cool. Really
It,
cool.
it is an awesome experience for sure. And as an air sign, um, I had some of the most difficult times connecting to air.
Really?
Yes. I connected to earth faster than anything else. Um, Fire came shortly after, water was right after that, and air was like, hey, bud, you forgot somebody.
Uh, oops.
And I'm like, yeah, I don't know how to connect to you. It's like, just exist, dude. Breathe.
Yes,
Okay.
that's air.
So once I've figured out air and I realized just how well I could connect to it because it is my sign,
Right.
it, the boost from that was just like, okay, yeah, no, I could work with this constantly.
Right. Right.
And then to be able to use that element to create my circle
Right.
is just even better. But then, having that specialization in that being the element that I call,
Yeah.
that it also just brings a sense of self joy and
Yeah. Yeah. Connection. That
fulfillment,
yeah.
fulfillment,
Yeah.
for being able to have made that connection. Um, but I also think it very necessary to work in a solitary way to make your connections with all your elements,
Yes.
be, because you want
Absolutely.
to be if you are working solitary, if you are doing your own circle, you need to be able to connect with all of them and have a certain strength in all of them.
Yeah.
But then
Definitely.
if you are working in a group and you do end up being one of those that has a dedicated element that you call, um, then 100%, you know, work on that, feel your sense of self fulfillment, and just, oh man, you'll notice a difference. You'll
Right.
notice a major difference.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. So, final comments that I have, and hopefully we've covered a lot of stuff that help people feel more confident in trying to cast their circle and create their own ritual for that. Um, Scott Cunningham also mentions he's one. So consistently, I read about the altar facing east, but Scott Cunningham made the comment of the altar facing the north because the north is the direction of power.
I've always heard have your altar in the north or the east,
Right.
or have your altar dead center, facing whatever way you want it to, because it doesn't matter at that point because it's in the center of everything.
Gotcha.
But usually it's facing north or east.
Right.
Um,
Well, the why behind it was for the north because it's the direction of power. And then for the east, it's because it's where the sun and moon rises.
right. The north always made sense to me because of the power aspect.
Right. Me too.
Um, but I can understand the east as well, just for having the rise of the sun and moon from that direction, and it also being symbolic of beginning and end.
Right.
So you always want to start out facing the beginning and work your way to the end, um, because you can only follow that path. Even in your circle of life, you have your beginning, you have your end. Whether it doesn't matter which way you go, you're going to reach that path one way or the other. So you're going to start facing with your sunrise.
I can understand and appreciate where you're coming from with that. And I understand the line of thought there. And that's all I can say.
I understand. Trust me. It's extremely difficult for me to put into words. And again, I understand what I'm trying to say. I understand the
Well, I
concept
get it.
behind it.
Right.
But again, the North has always been.
I have some thoughts on that I don't know where that line is drawn of what I can say and what I can't say.
We'll
Um,
discuss that.
yeah.
Just me and you.
Right. Because I feel like, yeah, there's more to that. But I will say this. I like the concept of having the altar facing the north for the direction of power. And
Yeah,
I will leave that right there.
I agree that I'm with you on the North.
Right.
The East has never made full sense to me, but I can get a generalized concept. But
Right.
yeah,
Yes. And I think what you just presented would be a great way of looking at it. So if some people are like, well, the East makes the most sense to me, or intuitively I feel like I want it in the East, I think what you just presented is a great reasoning for that. And
yeah,
that's
and
why it can
there's a
be a great way to do it.
there's
So
a little bit more that came with that as like an afterthought. The sun and moon rising in the east. You know, if you think about the way we don't really the way we see the sun and moon rise and set, we don't get to see the bottom side of it.
right.
And in the sense of life and death, again, life and death are all connected in a cycle.
Right.
And so as the sun rises, that's the light of your life. And then after your death, when your sun sets, it's not the end.
Right.
It's all still
Exactly.
continued. So
Exactly.
okay, we can leave that there. We're pushing 2 hours.
Yes, we are. I did want to touch on because we talked about it. The person I mentioned before about connecting with nature, and he put the elements where they felt best to him. There was a book written by, his name is Keldon, and it's just Keldon, Kelden. And the book is The Crooked Path, or The Crooked Path, or The Crooked Path. It's Crooked. And he mentions the circle, he compares it more to a compass. And so in the traditional craft that he is taught on, they call the circle the compass round. And so you lay the circle because you're laying a compass with those points and everything. And that as you're doing that, you're actually formulating a magical map of the natural realm and the other world. So it's just another way, another layer of looking at the circle, especially if you're one that you want to connect more to the nature aspect. And then again, he talked about we call in the spirits of north, south, east, and west, above and below, inviting them in and opening the roadways to their realms. And as such, we create a 6-way crossroad from which the center of power is the center of our circle and becomes the center of the natural and other world. So it gives you a little bit more to think about as far as how all these energies converge and the importance of the circle and what's possible within the circle. So I feel like that was just another layer I really want to make sure we touched on. And he also says that the elements at the 4 directions are called in or invited in, invoked, because they are the energetic building blocks of the natural world. And so when you're wanting to create change in this mundane, physical, natural world, you have to call in those energetics because they are the energetic building blocks of what creates what happens here in this time and space. So it's just another layer of thinking about, those elements and those directions and why they're important and why we call those in. And he is also one that says there's 4 steps to building the circle, but he starts in the north versus the east. And again, this is a guy that did things a little bit different the way he wanted to, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But he says the 4 steps are starting in the north. You go around the circle 4 times, first with incense, then with the candle flame, then with dirt versus salt, and then water. And so again, we see that using the 4 elements to create this circle. So there's that. So the final tidbit that I'm going to throw out there, because obviously we're going to need to do a Magic Circle 3, for those that want to dive deeper into the energetics and the magic and what the Magic Circle can do for you and your magic and the development of your magic. Obviously, we can't cover that because we're at almost 2 hours. So I will say this. The next books that we will be covering and talking on and bringing concepts and ideas and more that I didn't get to share with here is Tamara von Forslund, of course, my clan matriarch, and her incredible books. So she has the complete teachings of Wicca, book 1 and 2. When it says Wicca, you have to understand there's a bit of a translation for English American. It's really witchcraft for that term of Wicca. And then also covering her traditional witchcraft of the Clan of Boscawen, which is my go-to, where I'm at home now. So that book as well. But here's a little tidbit that I want to throw out as like a teaser of what will be coming up. If we think of the magic circle, it is 360 degrees. But we, as witches and pagans, lay a pentacle, the star, on top of that circle, okay? Which we could also look at as laying ourselves, like our 5 points on top of that circle. We add then 5 points to the 360 degrees of the circle, creating 365, which is then the days of the year. And on top of that, we then can go even further into the 9 feet, getting back to that 9, and everything that it encompasses. And we'll get more to that. But there's also on the human body 21 extensions, 10 fingers, 10 toes in our head, 21 representing the 21 power days of the witch, being the 8 Sabbats and the 13 full moons of each year correspond with that 21. So there's also in that magic circle at those 5 points, you can take your tarot deck and lay an inner circle and an outer circle, like we talked about circles within circles. And you can actually walk through your magic and your life using the tarot at these certain points to use them as keys, gateways, portals to your magic, to yourself, to your life, so that you can become not only a better, more powerful witch or wizard, but also a better person, stronger person, more self-empowered person. So those will be some things that we'll be covering more in part 3. So stay tuned for that. All right, Adam, we have just a few minutes. Any final thoughts?
I just can't believe we talked on this for 2 hours.
I know there's so much about it. Like,
okay, so we covered so much and yet so little
I know.
because there's still so much to go. I'm thinking, part 3 is going to be a lot of fun. But yeah, as you said, there might be a part 4, part 5. We might see the Magic Circle become a continuous series.
I think so, because we have yet to then again touch on how the witch's pyramid fits inside that circle.
Yeah.
So that's a whole other thing. So that might be a part 4. But we have to cover the witch's pyramid first so people know what that is. So yeah, stay tuned. This will be lots of fun, I do believe. And we hope you guys are getting a lot out of it, that you're feeling more empowered in your craft within your person. And let us know what questions you have. If we didn't cover something, let us know, so we can cover it in one of the future Magic Circle episodes. All right, you guys. Well, until next time, stay magical. We'll see you soon.
Bye.